But the most common definition of an adaptogen is a compound that is typically a supplement or a drug, although it could be a behavior if you really think about it, that helps you adapt to and buffer stress. So when you hear about adaptogens, there are three main categories of adaptogens that come to mind. The first are things that are contained in food. So these would be vitamins or micronutrients that one could easily find in food, but one would have to consume a fairly restricted number or type of foods in order to obtain those things, or consume a lot of those foods in order to get sufficient dosages of those adaptogen compounds in order to buffer stress. Some good examples of these would be any kind of vitamin, either water soluble or fat soluble, that can adjust or reduce what are so-called reactive oxygen species. And then that's what gives rise to this idea that antioxidants are good for us. Now, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a shift. What shift has occurred? Well, about 10 years ago, you often heard about antioxidants in vitamins, antioxidants in this food, this superfood, etc. And why were people talking about antioxidants? Well, just to remind you, reactive oxygen species are types of reactions and molecules that occur in cells when cells get stressed and or age, and antioxidants are the compounds that reduce those reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are bad for cells because they tend to hinder the function of mitochondria, which are associated with energy production in those cells. So what do we know for sure? We know that as cells get older, or as any cell or biological system, organ, tissue, etc., gets stressed a lot over time, the number of reactive oxygen species increases in those cells and tissues and organs. And antioxidants, which can include certain vitamins, but also some micronutrients, are effective in reducing those reactive oxygen species. Now, what's occurred over the last 10 years is that we know that reactive oxygen species are a major source of depleting cellular function by way of depleting mitochondrial function, but they are just one of many mechanisms that can deplete cellular function, mitochondrial function. So nowadays, you'll hear about reactive oxygen species and antioxidants, but not as much as you used to. Now you hear a lot more about inflammatory responses, and inflammatory cytokines also being an issue. And the truth is, all of these things are an issue. So going back to this question about adaptogens, adaptogens include these three categories. I've told you the first, which are the vitamins and micronutrients that are contained in food that can reduce reactive oxygen species and other aspects of cellular stress, such as inflammatory cytokines. What are some of those things that occur in foods? Well, in order to answer that, let's just think about what sorts of foods themselves can act as adaptogens. It's commonly held that the dark leafy greens type foods, for those of you that eat plants, and I think the majority of people out there do eat plants. I know that the carnivore diet and lion diet and some other diets tend to exclude plants. So we'll address that briefly at some point in today's discussion. But dark leafy greens are known to contain a number of compounds in the form of vitamins and micronutrients that are very effective in reducing reactive oxygen species and inflammatory cytokines. So if you're somebody who's interested in adaptogens and adaptogenic processes, reducing stress and buffering stress, which of course has its role in buffering daily stress in order to help you sleep better, to improve cellular function for longevity, sports performance, cognitive performance. That is all good, and it makes sense why people would be interested in adaptogens. But remember that the two main adaptogens that you should think to first are going to be behaviors and nutrition. I've started with nutrition on purpose. As I mentioned, we'll get to behaviors in a moment. So if you're interested in adaptogens at all, I highly recommend that you include at least 2 to 4 servings of dark leafy greens and or cruciferous vegetables per day. I think that'd be highly advantageous. And just be aware that excessively heating dark leafy greens or cruciferous vegetables can actually destroy the very nutrients and micronutrients that act in an adaptogenic way. That does not mean that you need to eat raw broccoli or cauliflower. Just the thought of that makes me nauseous. It's very hard to digest. Some people might like that or can digest it more easily than others. So it's perfectly fine to cook your cruciferous vegetables and dark leafy greens, but you don't want to overcook them. What's overcooking and what's undercooking? There's no strict cutoff in terms of temperature, but basically what the literature says is that if you heat vegetables to the point where the colored fluid is leaching out of them into a broth type, into water or whatever fluid surrounds them, well then you would be well off to ingest that fluid as well, because contained in the water or the fluid that's leaching out from the cruciferous vegetables or from the dark leafy greens are going to be a lot of those very adaptogenic molecules that you're interested in the first place. Okay, so I probably surprised some people by starting off my answer to the question of what are adaptogens, are they worth thinking about and pursuing, and if so, how can I get them, by talking about food. But I think it is important to understand that you can get a lot of adaptogens from food, and indeed some of the best adaptogens do come from dark leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. The other two categories of adaptogens are going to be supplement-based adaptogens and then behavioral adaptogens. Again, here adaptogen defined as anything that can buffer stress in a substantial or meaningful way. So when would you use these? Well, for instance, if you are in a particularly stressful mode of life, either because of family or relational or school or work demands or new kid in the house or any number of different things, or you've been ill or you're recovering from injury, taking an adaptogen in the form of a supplement can actually be very useful for buffering this hormone and the general systems it's associated with called cortisol. It's very healthy to have high levels of cortisol early in the day, shortly after you wake up, and then that ought to taper off toward the afternoon and evening. However, if cortisol is chronically elevated throughout the day, or if that peak in cortisol is arriving too late in the day, that is known to be associated with mental health and physical health issues. It has been shown by labs at Stanford and elsewhere. It's been shown in animal models and in humans. I've talked many times before, and I'll just remind you again, one of the best ways to restrict that cortisol peak to the early part of the day is to get morning sunlight in your eyes as soon as you can. Once the sun is up, get outside facing the direction of the sun, even on overcast days. Don't wear sunglasses. Look at it for 5 to 30 minutes. Definitely blink so you don't damage your eyes, so on and so forth. Why 5 minutes or 30 minutes? Well, 5 minutes on a clear day should be sufficient. Longer would be fine. Again, blink so that you protect your eyes. Blink as needed, facing the general direction of the sun. On days when you have a lot of overcast or it's really dark, dense cloud covered, well then you want to be outside longer. And if you don't have access to sunlight for whatever reason, then you want to do the same thing with bright artificial lights indoors, either so-called sad lamp or otherwise. That's a great way to restrict that cortisol peak to early in the day. But even if you're doing that, if you have a stressful life for whatever reason, even if you're getting that morning sunlight, which I hope you are, you're getting your exercise, you're trying to sleep better and more, as we all should most of the time, well then you may be somebody who wants to take a adaptogen in the form of a supplement.